It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay. Hi, Peggy. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good. I'm just looking at your bio here. Looks very interesting. And you've got a book out. Your book is called Girls in a World at War.
Yes.
This is about your mother?
It is.
Okay. Why did you decide to write a book about your mother?
Well, that's a very good question. My mother served in the Army during World War II. And about the time I was born, she typed up her experiences in serving overseas in France with a hospital over there. She wrote it up for publication, but it was never published. And she's been gone now for about 19 years, but I had a copy of her original manuscript, which was 660 pages. And I pulled it off the shelf and decided it was a good time for the world to hear my mother's story. So I have revised it and finally got it published.
So was she intending on having it published and just didn't get to it?
No, she was intending. That's a good question. I think part of it was she wrote it at the time where there wasn't that much discussion about the war. People just wanted to move on. It was also just plain really too long, 660 pages. And she used to say that people would prefer to hear her stories about the war, not read about them.
When did she write it?
She wrote it, again, about the time I was born. That would be 67 years ago. That would be in 1957 she wrote it up. She typed it up on an old typewriter.
Wow, that must have taken forever.
You know, she could type like, it was pretty darn fast. I don't actually think it took her that long. She was pretty gifted in that, and she could really tell a story. So.
Well, you said she was in the Army. What did women do in the Army back then?
Well, that's a really good question. It's pretty unusual to hear about a woman that was actually in the Army. You know, you hear about spies or you hear about Rosie the Riveter, but I'll tell you what happened. She was from a very wealthy family. In fact, in 1936, she went to the Berlin Olympics in Germany at the age of 16. She then went on to college at Iowa State. She graduated. She was a dietitian. She worked at Cook County Hospital as a dietitian intern. And then, as she put it, the first boy that ever gave me a kiss came home from the war in a body cast, and he was never going to walk again, likely. She decided that she needed to do something to help out in the effort. Well, she had a college degree, so she technically went in as an officer, a second lieutenant in the Army. Again, as a dietitian, that was, she had decided she was going to make Spam taste good, really.
All right.
I'm not kidding.
I think that's a trick to do that, because I don't think it's ever tasted great. But that's just my opinion. Some people really like it.
I know. I hear it's a delicacy in Hawaii.
Yeah, and there's places like, even in the Far East, they make Spam fried rice. And
yep.
Yeah, I don't know. Just wouldn't be my first choice, but anyways.
No, yours or not too many of the soldiers liked it either.
No. So she was a dietitian. So where was she stationed?
Well, what happened is she decided to write a book of her story, and she made it a story, and she claimed it was fiction. But I know these stories to be true. I know she did change a few names and places, as she said, to protect the innocent. But it covers the time from when she first went into basic training in Wisconsin, and then she was stationed in Ohio, Ohio. And then she was transferred overseas to France along with a general hospital group. It was not, just a general hospital. So that's where she served.
Oh, I see. Okay, but they didn't generally put women on the front lines or near the battle.
No, they sure didn't.
Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. And also, it was fairly new to actually be in the Army. They used to have people that they called civilians. But this was 1945, 44 and 45. So this was a little later in the war. And so, yes, she was definitely in the Army. I've got a picture of her. I've got her parts of her old uniform. But very, very unusual for a woman to be in the Army. That is a fact.
Well, they did have women that were nurses, certainly.
Yes. Yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
Now, were they civilian or were they Army nurses?
They were Army nurses. And in fact, a lot of times she was confused to be a nurse, and usually she just sort of ignored that. In fact, there was no dietitian training, so she went along with the nurses. And so, again, there was a lot of confusion. But, yeah, typically, if you were a woman in the Army, you were thought to be a nurse. There was a couple of physical therapists, and then she was also with several Red Cross girls. So that was sort of another division. But she was definitely in the Army.
Okay. There was something called the WACs.
Yes.
What was that?
Women Auxiliary Corps, I think. Women Auxiliary Corps. And so so that's the division that they called, or they termed, were the women in the Army, the WAC. In fact, there's a character in the book whose real name was McLean, and Lieutenant McLean, and she was an older woman and a school teacher type before she went into the Army. So again, quite a bit older. And her nickname was Mac the Whack, if you can believe that. Mac the WAC, Mac the Whack, yeah.
So in this book, does she talk about actually going to the Berlin Olympics?
Yes. Well, you know, that's a good question. I have video of when she went, and again, she was just 16 at the time, and she would tell me that she would do, when she was there, she would do what she called the Olympic salute, which looks just like the Hitler salute, and it was transformed. But at the time she was there, it was the Hitler salute, if you can believe that. They had used that a lot of times to celebrate champions. I mean, it goes back many years, and there is some history in that in the Olympics. She did not include that in the book. I added it as a prologue, as a backdrop, because she was on a German propaganda tour where, of course, you were going to come to Germany and they were going to show you how great Germany was and how nice the Germans were and all of that. So she was somewhat brainwashed by that experience, definitely. But to her dying day, she swore that was the Olympic salute that Adolf Hitler stole. So,
what was her overall impression of Germany at that time? Did she talk about it?
She didn't spend any time in Germany, but she definitely loved it. It's a beautiful place, and she loved the people. She went to several different locations, and again, this was in 1936, which was 3 years before, a lot of people say, when the war began.
Right.
So at the time, she wasn't suspecting anything bad. And there was, you know, what an adventure, right? And they went to several different countries. France was one of them. Ireland was one of them. Switzerland was one at the time. So, no, she was unsuspecting, but she definitely had a very high impression of the Germans and really sort of did think they could do no wrong.
So there was no sort of premonition of what was to come then at that point?
None.
Yeah.
None. No, in fact, I think she would have been one that would say, oh, those news articles about killing Jews, that can't be true. Those Germans wouldn't do that. I think she would fall into that camp of not believing it, because the Germans, they were not all awful people. She knew that to be true, right? That kind of thing. And I mean, the German propaganda was very effective. So she was actually a product of that. Her wealthy family and a person that believed in nothing but good in other people, which got her into all kinds of trouble. And she was a little Miss Priss, straight-lace, you know, kind of person. And she did not exactly fit into the Army at all.
Well, I'm curious about the reason that she went there at 16 years old. Was it just because, or just to go? Or just because she could afford it? Or?
I think it was. That's a good question. I don't know, if you grow up in a wealthy family, I think those are just what you do. At 16, and the Germans put out, there were some pretty good bargains, I think, for these huge trips. And so they really built up the Olympics in 1936, and they really put on a show. And so I'm sure her family totally trusted her. I think she went with a group of young people. In the book, I put that she was with her uncle because her and her uncle did a lot, and he was a Times correspondent, and he was in the book, and he tracked her down, and all of that. It would have been the place that he could be, but it was just an adventure. You probably know some 16-year-old girl from a wealthy family, and sure, they went off to the Olympics in Paris recently, didn't they? Well, lucky them, right?
Well, yeah, except if it was a bit different in 1936 because you can just jump on a plane and be there in a few hours now. But then, you had to cross the Atlantic on a ship, which was going to take, 4 or 5 days at least. And,
Yep.
it was much more of a to-do than it is now.
Oh, yeah, I think so. But I think just their family thought big. They just did. So it was a chance to see the Olympics. The price was right. Oh, my God, this is what we do. We go see the world. I think that's just how they thought. So not to say it wasn't a big to-do. In fact, I did track down from her home in Libertyville, Illinois. I tracked down 2 articles that were in the newspaper. It's almost like a debutante type of thing where they were announcing, come to Nancy Ewing's send-off. We're going to send her off to the Berlin Olympics and bring letters and bring gifts for her. And so it was kind of the event. It was an event there.
Wow.
So she was lucky to have gone.
Well, so if she was in Illinois, then she would have had to take a train probably to New York.
Yep.
And then
You're right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, sailed from New York. And
I believe her ship was actually called the Berlin.
It was a German ship, yeah.
Yeah, a German ship. I think I tracked it down. I've got some information on it, but yeah, it was a long voyage. And again, I have some video of it. You should see the smoke coming out of this ship. Oh my gosh, right?
Well, they were all coal-fired back then. Yeah, they burned coal.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've got just a couple minutes. Can you give us a highlight or two of the book, and then we'll wind it
Sure.
down.
I guess a lot of people like the part where she's in France, and so she visits Paris on several occasions. So you get a glimpse of Paris before the war, right after the war, when it's jammed with American GIs and green trucks, and then a little bit later when France finally starts coming back to life with gasoline back and cars tooting around. But most of the book takes place at a place called Sweeps, which is near Reims, near Reims Cathedral, not far from the Battle of the Bulge. The 82nd Airborne is just 10 miles away, so there's quite a few interactions with the 82nd Airborne. And, of course, these are the tough-as-nail guys, and they really liked the American women, so they had parties and invited them, and these girls were not so enthralled with the 82nd Airborne. So it's kind of a different slice on hearing about the 82nd Airborne in a book like this. But it's a lot about how they fed the soldiers. They had dehydrated food, canned food shortages, no sugar, all that kind of stuff. And they had a newborn baby born, and how do we feed this baby? We don't have baby formula. We don't have anything like that. So they also had a challenge of feeding the first prisoners that were released from the Dachau concentration camp came to their hospital.
Oh.
And there was a comment in the book of, we've got patients that were starved, and, I've seen starved patients before. Oh, no, not like this, you haven't. So then there was a challenge of feeding those starved patients, and then one of them died in my mother's arms. It was the first death at the hospital. So anyway, so there's a lot of challenges, but there was a lot of the women pulling together, and they just had to. They just had to face all this, and they just had to keep going. And there's a lot of very, very funny parts in the book. And again, my straight-laced little mother avoiding the men and avoiding drinking and avoiding the partying. And, again, she just didn't fit in. And then again, trips to Paris. There were trips to Switzerland. They also went to a place called Biarritz, which was the playground of the emperors and the empresses. And so this really glamorous place that they modified right after the war to be a place called Biarritz American University, sort of the precursor to the GI Bill. So they set up a teaching institution there where the GIs, there were so many waiting over there, waiting to get back, where they could go to class and get credits. And you can imagine some of those conversations and some of the romances that occurred at Biarritz University, this lovely place on the beach. So there's a lot of interesting things that are not in other books. And I guess one of the things people comment on it is it's very authentic. You just don't hear about it. And so it's fun to read about a woman's perspective, not a guy's perspective in the war. And again, it's pretty funny and pretty sad at some places as well, but pretty interesting. And then she meets my father at a train station in Paris. They're both on the way to this Biarritz University. So she meets my father there in France right after the war, too.
Oh, I see. So, okay.
There's a couple of romances in there, too. Improbable romances, I might add, from all around. So quite the characters in the book.
Has the book been released?
It has been released. Yes, it's out. And it's getting good reviews, which is kind of fun.
Okay, great. Well, Peggy, thank you for coming on the show. It was nice talking to you. And best of luck with the book. I hope it does well. Are you going to write another one? I mean, you said this was 600-page manuscript. Did you cut it down to fit it into one book?
I cut it down to 412 pages.
Okay.
With pictures.
So you don't have enough to do a part 2?
No. It's kind of the whole story. She comes home.
Yeah.
My father comes home. So.
Okay. Well, best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much.